Simon, talk to me about the budget. Talk to me about where you see the biggest impact. Talk to me about how investors might behave within that.
Obviously, everybody's keenly aware that we had the budget released last Tuesday, and there has already been a little bit of an aftershock in terms of the reaction amongst investors and the property market potentially as well. So, auction clearance rates over the weekend, so the first Saturday post budget, the preliminary results that have come out from that have shown fairly significant drop in the auction clearance rates. There's talk that it is around about the same levels that you were seeing in the pandemic. So back at pandemic era levels, Brendan, of auction clearance rates. And that's obviously making headlines. And the question we've got to ask is, well, is this just investors pausing and taking stock of the changes that have just been announced, or are we seeing the start of some bigger shift in behaviour that has greater longer term implications for the property market?
I'd like to suggest, Simon, that all investors are never going to buy again.
and I've told you a million times, Brendan, do not exaggerate. But that's the point, isn't it? You know, you get the extreme views. You get the views at the extreme that are like the sky is falling. It's property market Armageddon. It's the apocalypse for investors. No one will ever invest again. And the other extreme going, well, you know, this is just a blip and it's not going to have any real impact whatsoever. The truth, of course, is usually somewhere in the middle. And our role here is to try and cut through that noise and put some sanity to everything that's going on, some clarity to everything that's going on, and unpack the facts, not the emotional reactions that are going on. So I think when you look at what fell out of the budget, obviously you had changes to CGT rules, you've got changes to negative gearing rules, changes affecting taxation of trusts and so on. But I think from my perspective, Brendan, the biggest impact is really not explicit in the tax changes. It's what that some of the tax changes mean for borrowing capacity, particularly the curtailing of negative gearing for the purchase of established residential investment properties moving forwards from budget night. The fact that you can no longer negatively gear those has a hidden impact on investors' borrowing capacity. So for an investor who is looking to buy an established residential property in their own name, the amount that they can potentially borrow to do that may have changed. And the reason for that is that the banks, when they do servicing assessments of investors and they're looking at what that person can afford to borrow and they're looking at their disposable income, if they're buying an asset in their own name previously that was going to be negatively geared, they obviously get a bit of a rebate, a refund, an offset at tax time at the end of the year. There's a tick box in these servicing calculators that previously, for one of those purchases, the bank could tick, which then adds back to their income the benefit of those tax deductions that they might have got at the end of the year. So it effectively inflates their disposable income and therefore inflates the amount that they could otherwise borrow. Now, if you're buying an established property as an investment property, a residential investment property post-budget, the bank can no longer put a tick in that box. And so the borrowing capacity for the average investor buying in their own name just went down if they're looking to buy an established property. And the order of magnitude there is more or less equivalent to a 1% increase in interest rates overnight. It carves ballpark 10% out of the typical investor's borrowing capacity for buying an established house in their own name.
So in my mind, there are a couple of things there. So there's that the immediate impact of if I want to buy an established property, I can borrow less. So if I want to go and buy a better or a bigger property, then I'm driven into properties that are not established, new, off the plan, or just recently completed properties. Then you've got the whole, and I can't negative gear anymore as an investor. What does this mean for my cash flows as well on an annual basis, on a monthly basis?
Yeah, I think the majority of residential investors would simply be claiming back at tax time. So they may not, in fact, notice a difference in their monthly cash flows. It's more about then the borrowing capacity, I think.
Yeah, but annually, the refund you're able to get is less. The ability to, I mean, your annual income goes down. So there's a gap between what I used to enjoy and what I can enjoy now. Now, typically nationally, that's around about $8,500 to $9,000. So you're at a scenario where, hang on a minute, I've just had a $9,000 impact, which is the same sort of impact you're talking about, Simon,
Mm.
that diminishes your ability to borrow as much as you otherwise would have before budget night. So these two, both of these impacts on borrowing capacity and on cash flow get in the way of buying established property. So what is the market impact then, Simon? In your mind, the way you see it, where do you think and how do you think this will play out in the real world
Yeah.
post 1 July 2027?
Yeah, and that's important. We're talking about in the real world, not the political footballs that are out there or the extreme views that are getting clicks on the internet right now. The impact is not uniform in my mind. There are different impacts depending on where you are, cities versus regions. There are different impacts depending on what price bracket you might be dealing with, and there's the obvious differences between established and new. And maybe let's talk about where we think the impact would be felt or seen first, felt the most, seen the most. And in my mind, there's a big difference here between the top end of the market, the middle to top end of the market, and then the lower end of the market. If borrowing capacity for investors is reduced, then unless they just go completely cold turkey and don't buy anything, those that are active in the market will find that they can't buy as expensive a property, so they'll have to move down the price bracket. Now, even before the budget, Brendan, the analysis that you were doing in the background on trends and so on, you were already starting to see some differences in those top and middle tiers, yeah?
Yeah, so the trends of late have shown, and this we're talking about the last year, the demand for higher price, top 25% properties is diminished against the middle 50 and the bottom 25. And that's significantly contributed to by the 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers.
Yeah.
That has allowed an enthusiasm towards the lower end property market. So people who have enough cash to go and buy it at 5% can afford and get the cheaper ones. I don't need to spend these years saving. I can get in. Sure, it's a 95% LVR, but I'm sure I can handle it with my job, etc. And they go in and buy, and they're on the property ladder, but they're in the cheaper market. The top 25% have been experiencing a diminished growth for years. This is going to contribute more because if people were suddenly, I'm not able to buy what I want to buy because of, and we're talking about the established market now, I'm not able to buy in the established market because I can't borrow as much as an investor, then the burn to get into the top 25 is significantly less and it comes back a bit into the middle 50 bracket.
That's coming off the back of things like the recent increases in interest rates, which have reduced people's borrowing capacity generally and sucked demand out of those higher brackets because of that.
Yeah. So there's a whole pile of things going on in the economy broadly that are diminishing the burn for the highest priced properties and highest priced areas and supporting activity in the lowest price. So forecasting where that goes from here, broadly speaking, the lowest priced properties are still looking to grow and grow strongly. The highest priced properties are actually looking to diminish further. So I would suggest that there's a risk you're going to see negative growth in higher priced properties right across this country. And that's on the back of everything we've talked about so far. The middle 50 will be plateauing out but cooling down because broadly the market is in a cooling phase. The states themselves are starting to peak. The smaller states and the bigger states, Melbourne, Sydney, are already flat and in decline. So there's a lot going on. And again, you say this very frequently and I back it. You're not buying a city. You're buying a house within a suburb within a city. So consequently, you really need to get on the ground about what's happening in your local area and what's occurring. But those broader price points apply at a suburb level. Cheaper ones might be the way where the growth is going forward.
That's
But
right.
okay, let's talk then now about the idea of established versus new, because newer properties can still be high priced. Newer properties can be quite budget. Where do you see the play out in here?
Yeah, so because the negative gearing rules haven't changed if you're buying what's termed to be a new build, so something off the plan or something that's just been completed recently, then investors could very well be attracted more to those because they can still preserve their borrowing capacity for a new house, whereas they've got diminished borrowing capacity for an established house. So that supports demand for new housing, in fact, possibly even increases it if you have a migration of investors that would otherwise have established who decide no, instead, because I can afford more, because I can borrow more, I'll buy new instead. And I get my depreciation benefits and blah, blah, blah. So there could be very good support for new housing in the market at the moment, but possibly cannibalizing or softening price growth in some of the established housing areas. So at the moment, that borrowing capacity under the rules remains as it is now. But what psychologically I think that means for an investor is, oh, I can afford a more expensive new house than I can afford an established house, relatively speaking.
And agreed. So what we're likely to see then, broadly speaking, is those suburbs with significantly established dwellings with very little infill will experience less buying demand from investors, and therefore aggregating that up, less buying demand than, say, areas where there is greenfield estates or areas where there's a lot of new estate development, which does take the advantage of being able to negative gear and greater borrowing capacity. Consequently, you are likely to see a greater demand and more competition in those areas for those investors who wish to keep investing and to keep accumulating the property and building their property portfolio and offset, say, existing properties
Mm.
that are established with some new ones. Or I'm new to the market, let's go to, and I want to get in, I want to get on the ladder, I want to get started on my property portfolio, go and buy in those areas where I can get the tax benefits. So we're talking about a lift in demand in greenfield estates, new estates, large estate areas, new builds, with a diminished demand potentially in established areas.
Yep.
That's going to play out in the median price movement of those places.
Exactly. And I think if you subscribe to the old and somewhat dangerous philosophy that was often spruiked, that if you're investing in property, you should just go and try and find the most expensive property you can possibly afford and invest into that. Well, the most expensive property you can possibly afford now, based on your borrowing capacity as an investor buying in your own name, would be now a new build, not an established build. And so we might see some of that in the market here. Now, ironically, remember, a lot of the stated objectives around of this is supposedly to even the playing field with first home buyers and give first home buyers more of a leg up in the market. But when you think about what we've just been talking about the different price brackets and the fact that you might have investors moving down a price bracket or into lower prices because they can borrow less for established houses,
And then
and
also
if
out into the estates where there
and
are
if they're
cheaper
moving into,
properties.
correct, they're buying the new homes as well. Well, who are they directly competing against in those lower price brackets and in those new estates? And there's an potential unintended consequence here, that you, instead of making things easier for first home buyers, you're actually increasing the competition against them by incentivizing investors to compete against them in the lower price brackets and in the new estates. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. What about cities versus regions, Brendan, as well? So obviously we've got different price points, but that plays out in the regions as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. If you've got established properties that you can't, as an investor, you can't afford so much now, or you're driven into cheaper properties, that also drives you out of cities and more into regions as price points are much lower. A way to get the same amount of income, or have the same amount of cost in holding a property, is to buy more neutrally geared, or in fact more positively geared properties. They don't exist in cities, they exist more in the regions. So you're likely to find a percentage of investors shifting their modeling, shifting their approach from one of, you know what, I'm going to massively negatively gear because city growth is so great, it's going to make me the money I want through capital, into, I want to keep investing. I want to accumulate a property portfolio. I'm going to go for more neutrally geared properties that I can afford, that my income can sustain without the negative gearing component, and drive price up in the property belt. That would be a neutrally geared environment, or even increased demand on positively geared properties,
Yep.
which speaks traditionally to the regional areas just outside the major regional towns. So on the outskirts of those, you get far more neutrally geared environments. and then more positively geared opportunities. So I'm suggesting that there will be a proportion of investors who will shift their thinking to accommodate that and potentially offset some of the costs as a planned strategic approach. Use positively geared to offset costs for the more negatively geared established properties that they want to buy for growth. So you might get then a more sophisticated blend in strategy about what gets purchased. But I would like to suggest that this modelling has the capacity to increase regional prices and demand in regions as well.
Yeah, and it comes back to that point you made earlier that we don't buy a city, we buy a property within a suburb, and it's whether that suburb is within a capital city or whether it's in the regions, you're going to see significant differences, aren't you, from one to the next. So it's really important, as you say, to get on the ground and understand what really is happening there in terms of the dynamics and be able to make sense of that before you buy, as you would have done before any of these changes in any case if you're acting as a more sophisticated investor rather than throwing a dart at a dartboard. The message is not stop investing. It's not get caught up in these changes and the hype and the extreme views and so on and be paralyzed with indecision. It's not stop investing, but what it is a clear message to stop relying on tax concessions to make marginal deals look acceptable. Now, property investing was never meant to be about chasing tax deductions. The strongest investors are going to be the ones that can adapt, can think strategically, the ones that will buy assets that still make sense when the tax assumptions are stripped back. So the game hasn't ended, it's just that some of the rules have changed. And as smarter investors, we need to adapt, because investors who keep playing by the old rules are going to find that the market moves on without them.
Give up and give up now. Grab your blankies, go and hide in the rock backwards and forwards with your thumb in your mouth and hope it all goes away. It's not going away.
No, I mean, but given the rules have changed, to that end, like you and I are going to run a special workshop Saturday, 30th of May, 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. We're going to get together online, run a workshop that we're calling The New Rules of Property Investing, about what works now that negative gearing has changed, giving people some ideas about how to adapt your strategies, but also providing some insights into some of our latest forecasts on where the market's going around the country as part of that as well. RSVP for that in the upcoming event space, and we'll see you there.
Guys, I want to thank you ever so much for joining us. We wish you the very, very best with your investing. Stay alert, not alarmed. The changes have both cost and benefit, and the encouragement here is understand where the benefit for you may lie, and then start to work on those as opportunities and direction for the approach to your next purchase. We wish you the very best, and until we meet again, invest wisely. Thanks, guys.
See you next Thursday.